The Galactic Council had seen many species rise and fall across the stars. In their grand chamber that floated between three suns, representatives from 47 different worlds gathered to discuss trade routes, territorial disputes, and the endless paperwork of maintaining peace across the galaxy. To them, humans were newcomers. Barely 200 years since they had achieved faster-than-light travel, Earth's people were considered primitive, emotional, and largely irrelevant. Ambassador Zethkar of the Hegemony scratched his scaled chin as he reviewed the latest reports. Humans had been making noise again about joining the inner circle of the Council, demanding better trade agreements and representation. The tall reptilian being found their persistence amusing, like watching insects try to understand mathematics. His species had controlled trade routes for over 3,000 years. What could these mammals possibly offer? "The humans send another delegation request," announced Coordinator Vess, her crystalline form chiming softly as she moved. The silicon-based life form served as the Council's neutral mediator, though neutrality often favored whoever held the most economic power. They wished to discuss the Kepler Station incident. Several Council members exchanged glances. The Kepler Station incident had been a minor shipping dispute 3 months ago. A human research vessel had been stopped at one of the Hegemony's checkpoint stations for carrying unauthorized biological samples. Standard procedure, nothing more. The fact that the humans were still talking about it showed their inexperience with galactic politics. "What is there to discuss?" Zethkar's voice carried the dismissive tone his species was known for. "They violated shipping regulations. We confiscated contraband. The matter is closed." What the Galactic Council didn't know, what their reports had failed to mention, was that the unauthorized biological samples had included a 10-year-old human girl named Sarah Chen. She had been traveling with her parents, both xenobiologists studying rare plant life on the Outer Rim worlds. When Hegemony forces boarded their ship, they had followed protocol to the letter. Any biological matter not properly documented would be quarantined immediately. The problem was that their scanners registered all carbon-based life as potential biological contraband. Sarah, frightened and trying to hide from the alien boarders, had been detected in a storage compartment. The automated systems had classified her as an undocumented biological specimen and transported her to a containment facility before anyone realized the mistake. Dr. Marcus Chen had screamed until his voice gave out. Dr. Lisa Chen had thrown herself at the containment field until the guards stunned her unconscious. But the Hegemony officials simply followed procedure. Unauthorized biological specimens would be studied, cataloged, and disposed of according to Regulation 47B. The fact that this particular specimen was sentient and the offspring of 2 extremely desperate parents was noted in their reports but deemed irrelevant to the process. Sarah spent 17 days in a containment cell designed for storing potentially dangerous organisms. She was given water and basic nutrients through feeding tubes. Scientists took blood samples, tissue samples, and subjected her to various scans to determine her biological classification. To them, she was simply an interesting primate specimen that showed unusual neural activity. The girl never stopped asking for her parents. She drew pictures on the condensation of her cell walls. She sang songs her mother had taught her. She cried herself to sleep every night on the cold metal floor. None of this was considered relevant data by her captors. It was only when a human diplomatic team finally traced their missing research vessel to Kepler Station that Sarah was discovered. The Hegemony officials were genuinely surprised by the humans' reaction. They had followed procedure exactly. The biological specimen had been well maintained and studied according to standard protocols. They couldn't understand why the humans seemed so emotionally compromised by the situation. "The specimen appears to be a juvenile of your species," the station commander had explained to the human diplomats with the patience one might show to children. Our scientists have gathered considerable data about human biological processes. Quite fascinating, really. The specimen will be returned to you naturally, though I'm afraid the extended testing has left it somewhat traumatized. Ambassador Sarah Okafor, Earth's chief diplomat to the Outer Rim, had looked at the broken child trembling behind a force field and felt something cold settle in her chest. Sarah Chen couldn't speak for 3 days after her rescue. When she finally did talk, it was only to ask if the monsters were coming back. The report filed by the hegemony was clinical and brief. One human juvenile had been mistakenly detained during a routine contraband investigation. The specimen had been returned to its species with minimal lasting effects. Compensation would be provided according to standard restitution protocols. The matter was closed. Ambassador Okafor's report to Earth Command was very different. It detailed every moment of Sarah Chen's ordeal, every casual reference to a terrified child as a specimen, every bureaucratic excuse for torturing an innocent 10-year-old girl. She included recordings of Sarah's parents begging for their daughter's life and the dismissive responses of hegemony officials who couldn't understand what the fuss was about. The report reached Earth on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the Global Defense Council had been called into emergency session. By Friday, Admiral Elena Vasquez was standing before the assembled leaders of every nation on Earth with a recommendation that would have seemed impossible just days before. "They took a child," she said simply. "A 10-year-old girl who was traveling with her parents on a legitimate research mission. They imprisoned her, experimented on her, and called her a specimen. When we objected, they offered us a standard shipping compensation of 2,000 credits and told us the matter was closed." President Martinez of the North American Federation rubbed his temples. "What exactly are you proposing, Admiral?" "Total economic blockade to start. No human ship service any hegemony routes. No trade agreements. Complete isolation until they formally apologize and change their protocols to recognize human sentience." Chancellor Okonkwo of the African Union frowned. "The economic implications would be severe. The hegemony controls 60% of the trade routes in the Outer Rim. We'd lose access to rare minerals, advanced technologies." "With respect, Chancellor," Admiral Vasquez's voice was steady but carried an edge that made several leaders lean forward. "They tortured a child. They tortured her for 17 days, called her an animal, and then couldn't understand why we were upset. If we let this stand, what message does that send about how Earth protects its people?" Prime Minister Singh of the Asian Cooperative looked thoughtful. "The Galactic Council would side with the hegemony. They always do. Economic pressure alone won't be sufficient." Admiral Vasquez nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I'm recommending we prepare for war." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for barely 2 centuries. They were outnumbered thousands to 1. Their technology was primitive compared to species that had been traveling between stars for millennia. The idea of Earth declaring war on the hegemony was like an ant declaring war on an elephant. "Admiral," President Martinez said carefully, "I need you to understand what you're suggesting. The hegemony has been the dominant military power in this sector for 3,000 years. They have battle fleets that could turn Earth into molten slag. You're talking about species suicide over one child." Elena Vasquez had served in Earth's defense forces for 32 years. She had fought pirates in the asteroid belt, defended mining colonies from raiders, and helped establish humanity's first settlements beyond the solar system. She had seen the best and worst of what humans could do when pushed to their limits. But she had also watched the recordings of Sarah Chen's rescue, seen the emptiness in a 10-year-old's eyes after 17 days of systematic dehumanization. "Mr. President," she said quietly, "if we're the kind of species that abandons our children when the odds are bad, maybe we don't deserve to survive." The debate raged for 14 hours. Military advisors presented devastating analyses of humanity's chances against the hegemony. Economic ministers calculated the cost of losing access to galactic trade routes. Diplomats argued for working within the system, filing appeals with the Galactic Council and seeking peaceful resolution. But every time the discussion seemed to move toward compromise, someone would mention Sarah Chen. The recordings of her crying for her parents, the clinical reports describing a terrified child as biological specimen 47B, the casual dismissal of her suffering by beings who couldn't understand why humans made such a fuss about one juvenile. Minister Chen Wei of the Pacific Federation was the one who finally spoke the truth that everyone was dancing around. This isn't really about military strategy or economic consequences. This is about who we are as a species. Do we protect our own, no matter the cost? Or do we make practical calculations about acceptable losses? The final vote was closer than many expected. 32 nations supported Admiral Vasquez's recommendation. 18 voted for continued diplomatic pressure. 3 abstained. But the majority was clear, and when President Martinez stood to address the Global Assembly, his voice carried the weight of history. Earth hereby withdraws from all treaties and trade agreements with the hegemony effective immediately. We demand the release of all humans currently held in hegemony custody, formal recognition of human sentience and legal rights, and a public apology for the treatment of Sarah Chen. If these demands are not met within 30 days, we will consider ourselves at war with the hegemony and any species that supports them. The message was transmitted to the Galactic Council within hours. The response was swift and predictable. Ambassador Zethkar himself replied, his tone mixing amusement with condescension. The humans appear to be experiencing some form of collective emotional breakdown. We understand that primitive species often form irrational attachments to their offspring, but this reaction seems excessive even by mammalian standards. The hegemony has offered fair compensation for any inconvenience caused by standard security procedures. We will not be intimidated by threats from a species that has barely mastered interstellar travel. The Council's official response was even more dismissive. They expressed concern about humanity's disproportionate emotional response and suggested that Earth might benefit from cultural education programs to help them better understand galactic civilization. Several council members offered to mediate the dispute, assuming it would blow over once humans realized the futility of challenging the established order. What none of them understood was that humanity had already passed the point of no return. The decision to go to war hadn't been made by governments or military leaders. It had been made by every parent who looked at Sarah Chen's story and saw their own child. It had been made by every human being who realized that their species was considered so expendable that torturing their children was seen as a minor bureaucratic error. Admiral Vasquez began mobilizing Earth's entire military within hours of the declaration. It wasn't much by galactic standards, 300 ships of various classes, most designed for system defense rather than interstellar warfare. But humans had always been good at making do with what they had. The real preparation, however, was happening in laboratories and research facilities across Earth and its colonies. Dr. Sarah Chen's parents, now driven by a fury that burned colder than deep space, had volunteered to lead a crash program in biotechnology research. If the galaxy saw humans as clever animals, then perhaps it was time to show them just how dangerous animals could be when protecting their young. Dr. Elena Kowalski, Earth's leading expert in nanotechnology, canceled her sabbatical and began working 18-hour days developing new weapon systems. Her team had been studying hegemony technology for decades, looking for defensive applications. Now they were looking for weaknesses. The most significant development came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen, despite her trauma, had retained perfect recall of her time in captivity. Working with child psychologists and intelligence analysts, she provided detailed information about hegemony security protocols, the layout of their facilities, and the behavior patterns of their soldiers. "They don't really see us as people," she explained to Admiral Vasquez during one of their sessions. The 10-year-old spoke with a composure that broke hearts throughout Earth's military command. "They kept talking about me like I was a pet or something. They weren't being mean on purpose. They just didn't think I mattered." Admiral Vasquez knelt down to meet Sarah's eyes. "You matter to us. Every single human being matters to us, and we're going to make sure the galaxy understands that." As the 30-day deadline approached, the hegemony showed no signs of backing down. If anything, they seemed amused by humanity's posturing. Several hegemony commanders made public statements about the educational value of teaching young species about the realities of galactic power. The Galactic Council called for calm and offered to host peace talks. Various species offered to broker agreements that would allow both sides to save face. But humanity's response was always the same: full recognition of human rights, formal apology, and guarantees that no human child would ever be treated as a biological specimen again. 3 days before the deadline, Ambassador Zethkar made one final offer. The hegemony would pay additional compensation, establish better protocols for identifying sentient species, and even issue a statement of regret for any misunderstanding that may have occurred. Admiral Vasquez's reply was broadcast across the galaxy. "They tortured a child for 17 days and called her an animal. No amount of money will fix that. No half-hearted apology will undo the trauma they caused. They will recognize that every human life has value, or they will learn to fear us." The deadline passed quietly. For 48 hours, nothing happened. Some commentators suggested that humanity had realized the futility of their position and backed down quietly. The Galactic Council began discussing face-saving measures that would allow Earth to rejoin the civilized galaxy without too much embarrassment. Then the attacks began. The first target was a hegemony supply depot orbiting Kepler 442b, the same system where Sarah Chen had been imprisoned. The depot was heavily defended by automated weapon platforms and a garrison of 200 soldiers. Intelligence reports suggested it would take a fleet of at least 50 ships to have any hope of breaching its defenses. Humanity sent 3. Captain Maria Santos commanded the lead vessel, a modified cargo hauler called the Determination. Her ship looked like exactly what it was: a converted merchant vessel with minimal armor and outdated weapons. The hegemony defenders barely bothered to raise full shields as the 3 human ships approached. Their commander, Sub-Admiral Vrock, actually laughed when he saw the intelligence reports. "3 cargo ships?" he asked his tactical officer. "Are the humans delivering our surrender terms personally?" What the hegemony scanners didn't detect were the 30,000 microscopic drones that had been released during the human ship's approach. Each drone was smaller than a grain of sand, powered by fusion cells that would have been impossible to create just months before. They drifted through space like cosmic dust, completely invisible to the depot's sensors. The drones attached themselves to the depot's hull, its defensive platforms, and even the hegemony ships themselves. Once in position, they began their work with mechanical precision. Some drones targeted critical systems, eating through power conduits with molecular disassemblers. Others released tailored viruses into the station's computer networks, viruses designed specifically to exploit weaknesses in hegemony software architecture. But the most devastating drones carried a simple cargo: Earth bacteria, modified to survive in vacuum and programmed to consume specific metal alloys used in hegemony equipment. The attack lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes for 17 days of Sarah Chen's captivity. The depot's shields failed first as power conduits dissolved from within. Weapons platforms turned on each other as their targeting systems fell victim to human-designed computer viruses. Life support systems throughout the station began failing as critical components were literally eaten away by engineered bacteria. Sub-Admiral Vrock's final transmission was confused and terrified. "How are they doing this?" "Our shields are at full power, but systems are failing everywhere. It's like the station is dissolving from the inside. Request immediate assistance." The transmission cut off as the depot's main reactor went critical. The explosion could be seen from 3 star systems away. Captain Santos didn't waste time celebrating. The moment the depot was confirmed destroyed, her small fleet jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind only radiation signatures and a field of microscopic drones that would continue consuming any hegemony salvage for the next 10 years. The news of the depot's destruction sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council. The hegemony had lost more than a strategic supply base. They had lost their sense of invulnerability. For 3,000 years, no one had successfully attacked a hegemony installation. The technology gap between the hegemony and other species was simply too large to bridge. Ambassador Zethkar stood before the council, his usual composure cracked. "This was clearly a terrorist attack using some form of unknown weapon. The humans must have received outside assistance. No primitive species could develop this technology on their own." But intelligence reports from across the galaxy were painting a different picture. Human ships were appearing in dozens of systems simultaneously, always in small groups, always targeting hegemony assets. They didn't fight like any known military doctrine suggested. They used suicide attacks, biological weapons, computer viruses, and tactics that seemed designed more to terrorize than to achieve strategic objectives. The second major attack came 3 days later. The target was a hegemony research facility studying exotic matter applications, the same facility where Sarah Chen's biological samples had been processed. The facility was protected by a full battle group of 12 ships, including 2 heavy cruisers with enough firepower to level a planet. This time, humanity didn't even send ships. Dr. Elena Kowalski had spent her career studying the theoretical applications of nanotechnology. In the past months, driven by a cold fury that surprised even her colleagues, she had turned theory into terrifying reality. Her latest creation was a self-replicating probe no larger than a marble, capable of crossing interstellar space using its own miniature hyperspace generator. The probe materialized inside the research facility's main laboratory, having bypassed every defense by arriving from hyperspace directly inside the target. Within seconds, it released its payload, a swarm of nanobots programmed with one simple directive: find the biological samples taken from specimen 47B. Protect them at all costs. The nanobots spread through the facility like a silver plague, ignoring hegemony personnel and equipment until they located the preserved tissue samples from Sarah Chen. The samples were being stored in a high-security vault, protected by multiple layers of encryption and physical barriers. The nanobots cut through every barrier like it wasn't there. But instead of destroying the samples, they began to replicate, using the facility's own resources to create more nanobots. Within hours, the entire research station was filled with trillions of microscopic guardians, all programmed to defend the tissue samples that had been stolen from a 10-year-old girl. The hegemony scientists tried everything. They attempted to evacuate the samples, only to watch their transport containers dissolve the moment they tried to move them. They tried to destroy the samples with energy weapons, but the nanobots formed an impenetrable barrier around their target. They even tried to abandon the facility entirely, but the nanobots began consuming the station's hull whenever anyone attempted to leave. For 6 days, the facility remained under the control of microscopic machines that had turned a research station into a fortress dedicated to protecting fragments of a human child's DNA. The trapped hegemony personnel sent increasingly desperate messages describing their situation. They were not being harmed, but they could not leave. They could not conduct research. They could not even access their own computer systems. On the 7th day, the nanobots received a new signal from Earth. The signal contained the brain patterns and genetic markers of one Sarah Chen, age 10, transmitted with a simple message. The specimen identifies herself as Sarah. Please return her property. The nanobots immediately began disassembling the research facility from the inside out, carefully preserving the tissue samples and the station's research data. Within hours, the entire facility had been converted into raw materials and information packets that were transmitted back to Earth through quantum entanglement communicators. When hegemony rescue ships finally arrived, they found only empty space and a single message buoy broadcasting in basic galactic standard. Specimen 47B sends her regards. The psychological impact of the research facility's capture was even greater than the military loss. The hegemony had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, their ability to control and categorize lesser species. Now they were facing an enemy that could turn their own technology against them, that could reach inside their most secure facilities and transform them into weapons. But humanity was just getting started. Admiral Vasquez had restructured Earth's entire military around the concept of asymmetric warfare. Humans couldn't match the hegemony ship for ship or weapon for weapon, but they didn't need to. They just needed to make the cost of occupying human space too high for any rational species to accept. The third wave of attacks targeted hegemony personnel directly. Dr. Marcus Chen, Sarah's father, had developed what he called empathy viruses, biological agents that wouldn't harm hegemony physiology but would cause intense emotional responses. Specifically, they would cause hegemony soldiers to experience human-level empathy for their victims. The virus was deployed through the water supplies of 3 hegemony military bases. Within days, entire companies of hardened soldiers were refusing orders to attack civilian targets. They reported experiencing strange sensations they couldn't describe, feelings of guilt, protective instincts toward smaller beings, and an overwhelming need to avoid causing unnecessary suffering. Hegemony commanders tried to treat it as a medical emergency, isolating affected soldiers and searching for a cure. But the virus was designed to integrate with the host's nervous system permanently. Soldiers who had been exposed would never again be able to see other sentient beings as disposable resources. The most dramatic example occurred on Hegemony Base Gamma 7, where Commander Thys ordered an orbital bombardment of a human research colony. The weapons officer, recently infected with the empathy virus, looked at the targeting display and saw not strategic targets, but homes where families lived. He saw children like Sarah Chen who would die screaming if he followed orders. The weapons officer turned his particle cannon on his own command structure instead. The mutiny spread through the base within hours. Soldiers who had spent their careers following orders without question suddenly couldn't understand how they had ever justified attacking civilian populations. Many of them contacted the human research colony to apologize and warn them of incoming hegemony reinforcements. But perhaps the most terrifying development from the hegemony's perspective was humanity's approach to prisoners of war. When hegemony soldiers were captured, they weren't tortured or executed. They were educated. The first hegemony prisoners were taken during a raid on a supply convoy. The human boarding parties could have easily killed the entire crew, but instead they sedated everyone and transported them to a secure facility on Earth's moon. There, the prisoners were introduced to Dr. Sarah Washington, Earth's leading expert in interspecies psychology. Dr. Washington's methodology was simple but devastating. She showed the prisoners recordings of human families, human children playing, human art and music and literature. She explained human concepts of love, sacrifice, and the parent-child bond. Most importantly, she showed them the footage of Sarah Chen's rescue and made sure they understood exactly what their species had done to a terrified 10-year-old. The psychological impact was immediate and permanent. Hegemony culture had evolved around the concept of genetic optimization and species hierarchy. They saw emotion as weakness, attachment as inefficiency. But watching Sarah Chen cry for her parents while being subjected to medical experiments forced them to confront the reality of their actions. Within weeks, the first hegemony prisoners were requesting asylum on Earth rather than repatriation to their home worlds. They began working with human intelligence services, providing detailed information about hegemony military capabilities and strategic planning. But more importantly, they became advocates for change within their own culture. Commander Zess Hai had been a loyal hegemony officer for 47 years when she was captured during a human raid on a logistics hub. 3 weeks later, she was transmitting underground broadcasts to hegemony worlds, describing what she had learned about human civilization and questioning everything she had been taught about species hierarchy. "We were told that emotion makes beings weak," she said in one broadcast that reached 17 million hegemony citizens. "But I have seen humans risk everything to protect one child. I have seen them declare war against impossible odds because they refuse to accept that any life is disposable. How is this weakness? How is this inferior to our cold efficiency?" The broadcasts were causing civil unrest throughout hegemony space. Younger hegemony citizens, many of whom had grown uncomfortable with their species' treatment of other life forms, began organizing protests and demanding reforms. Older citizens, raised on concepts of genetic superiority and species hierarchy, couldn't understand how their children had been infected with such dangerous ideas. But the most significant change was occurring within the Galactic Council itself. Species that had always deferred to hegemony leadership were beginning to question the established order. The footage of Sarah Chen's ordeal had been broadcast across the galaxy, and many council members were struggling to justify their continued support for a species that could torture children with bureaucratic indifference. The Crystalline Confederation, a group of silicon-based life forms known for their logical approach to problem-solving, withdrew their support from the hegemony after conducting a detailed analysis of the Sarah Chen incident. Their official statement was devastating in its clinical precision. "After reviewing all available data, we conclude that the hegemony's treatment of the human juvenile designated Sarah Chen demonstrates a fundamental failure of rational decision-making. Any species that cannot distinguish between legitimate security concerns and the systematic torture of children lacks the cognitive sophistication necessary for leadership within galactic civilization." Similar statements began coming from species across the galaxy. The gas giant collective, the hive minds of Epsilon Eridani, even the notoriously neutral Trade Federation began expressing concerns about the hegemony's methods and judgment. Ambassador Zethkar found himself increasingly isolated within the council. His usual allies were distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with a species that had somehow managed to turn a minor shipping dispute into a galactic crisis. His requests for military support were met with polite refusals and suggestions for diplomatic solutions. Meanwhile, humanity's attacks were becoming increasingly sophisticated and psychologically targeted. They had moved beyond destroying military assets to undermining the very foundations of hegemony society. Human agents, many of them former prisoners of war who had defected from the hegemony, were infiltrating hegemony worlds and spreading ideas about individual rights, the value of emotion, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. The ideas were proving more destructive than any weapon. Hegemony citizens who had never questioned their society's structure were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did their species consider compassion a sign of weakness? Why were they taught that other life forms were inherently inferior? Why had they never developed concepts like individual rights or the protection of children? On Hegemony Prime, the species' homeworld, protests were erupting with increasing frequency. Young hegemony citizens carried signs reading "Sarah Chen Matters" and "No child is just a specimen." Older citizens, raised on traditional values of species superiority and emotional suppression, were horrified by what they saw as cultural contamination. The protests reached a tipping point when a group of hegemony children, inspired by stories of human family bonds, refused to participate in the traditional culling of weakness ceremony, where defective offspring were removed from the population. The children, some no older than Sarah Chen herself, declared that they would protect each other regardless of genetic optimization scores. Hegemony authorities attempted to restore order by force, but found themselves facing an unprecedented problem. Many of their own soldiers, influenced by human concepts of empathy and child protection, refused orders to harm the protesting children. Some officers actually joined the protests, declaring that they could no longer serve a system that treated children as disposable resources. The civil unrest was spreading across dozens of hegemony worlds. The species that had maintained rigid social control for millennia was fracturing under the influence of ideas that seemed both foreign and irresistibly compelling. The concept that every individual had inherent worth, regardless of genetic optimization or social utility, was proving more infectious than any biological weapon. Admiral Vasquez monitored these developments from Earth's military command center, but she felt no satisfaction in the chaos spreading through hegemony space. This wasn't about revenge or conquest. It was about establishing a principle that would protect children like Sarah Chen from ever experiencing such horrors again. The hegemony's responses to the civil unrest were becoming increasingly desperate. They imposed martial law on several worlds, restricted communications to prevent the spread of human contamination, and even attempted to develop counter-propaganda that portrayed empathy and individual rights as forms of mental illness. But their efforts were undermined by their own people. Hegemony scientists who had been exposed to human culture began publishing research papers questioning the biological basis of their species' emotional suppression. Hegemony artists, inspired by human concepts of beauty and individual expression, created works that celebrated diversity and condemned their society's rigid hierarchies. Most damaging of all were the testimonies of former prisoners who had been educated by Dr. Washington and her team. These former soldiers and officials provided detailed accounts of what they had learned about human society, contrasting it with their own upbringing and cultural indoctrination. Commander Zeshai's broadcasts had evolved into a comprehensive critique of hegemony civilization. She interviewed other defectors, analyzed historical decisions through the lens of human ethics, and asked questions that millions of hegemony citizens had never considered. Why do we destroy art that doesn't meet optimization standards? She asked in one particularly influential broadcast. Why do we separate children from their parents at the age of 5? Why do we consider love a mental defect that must be corrected? The humans showed me recordings of their families, their art, their music. They showed me what it means to choose compassion over efficiency. How can we continue to call this weakness when it produces such strength? The broadcasts were reaching even the highest levels of hegemony government. Several council members had privately contacted Earth's diplomatic channels, suggesting that they might be willing to negotiate new agreements that would recognize human rights and establish better protections for civilians. The offers were tentative and carefully worded, but they represented the first cracks in the hegemony's monolithic leadership. Admiral Vasquez studied the intelligence reports flowing in from across the galaxy. The war was progressing exactly as she had hoped, but she knew that the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The hegemony was still the dominant military power in the galaxy, and desperate enemies often made the most unpredictable choices. Her fears were confirmed when intercepted communications revealed that Hegemony High Command was preparing something they called Final Solution Protocol. The details were classified at the highest levels, but the implications were clear. If the hegemony couldn't restore order through conventional means, they were prepared to escalate the conflict beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Earth's intelligence services worked around the clock to gather more information about the protocol. What they discovered sent cold fear through every human who read the reports. The hegemony was preparing to sterilize Earth and every human colony with biological weapons that would make their previous atrocities look like minor infractions. The message was clear. If humanity wouldn't submit to their proper place in the galactic hierarchy, they would be eliminated entirely. The hegemony would rather commit genocide than admit that a primitive species could challenge their authority successfully. Admiral Vasquez called an emergency session of Earth's military leadership. The stakes had escalated beyond anything they had imagined when the war began. They were no longer fighting for recognition or apology. They were fighting for the survival of their entire species. "They're planning to kill every human in the galaxy," she told the assembled officers. "Men, women, children, everyone. They call it genetic sterilization in their documents, but it's pure genocide. If we don't stop them, in 6 months there won't be a single human left alive." The room was silent as the implications sank in. They had known the war was dangerous, but this was different. This was existential. The hegemony wasn't trying to defeat humanity. They were trying to erase them from existence. "What are our options?" asked General Patterson, commander of Earth's ground forces. Admiral Vasquez looked at the faces around the table. These were good people who had signed up to defend humanity, not to wage a war of mutual annihilation. But circumstances had moved beyond their control. "We have one chance," she said quietly. "We hit them first. We hit them so hard that they can't recover, and we make sure the entire galaxy understands what happens to anyone who threatens human children." The decision was made in that room, by people who understood the weight of what they were choosing. Humanity would launch one final, devastating attack that would either end the war decisively or lead to their complete annihilation. Either way, the galaxy would remember that when they threatened one human child, Earth had been willing to risk everything to prove that every life mattered. The plan that would either save humanity or destroy it was born in the mind of Sarah Chen herself. 3 months after her rescue, the 10-year-old girl who had endured 17 days as a biological specimen approached Admiral Vasquez with an idea that would terrify the galaxy. "They kept talking about how humans think differently than other species," Sarah said during one of their regular meetings. She had been working with military psychologists to process her trauma, but her sessions had evolved into something more like strategic planning conferences. "They said our brains work wrong because we have too much emotion. But what if that's not a weakness? What if that's exactly what we need?" Admiral Vasquez listened as Sarah explained her observations of hegemony behavior during her captivity. Their decision-making processes were logical but predictable. They followed protocols exactly, even when those protocols led to obviously harmful outcomes. They couldn't adapt quickly to unexpected situations because their entire culture was built around predetermined responses to categorized threats. "They're like computers," Sarah said with the clarity that only children can achieve. "Really smart computers, but still just computers, and computers can be hacked." The idea that emerged from their conversation was simultaneously brilliant and horrifying. If the hegemony was planning to commit genocide against humanity, then humanity would respond by threatening to commit genocide against the concept of rational thought itself. Dr. Elena Kowalski was given unlimited resources and a completely impossible deadline. Her team had 2 weeks to develop a weapon that could target not ships or planets, but ideas themselves. They called it the Empathy Cascade, and it was designed to be humanity's final gift to a galaxy that had underestimated the power of caring about others. The weapon was a hybrid of nanotechnology, quantum computing, and biological engineering that could literally rewrite the neural pathways of any carbon-based life form within a specified range. But instead of causing damage or death, the empathy cascade would force its targets to experience human-level emotional responses to the suffering of others. Imagine, Dr. Kowalski explained to the assembled Earth leadership, every hegemony soldier suddenly feeling the same protective instincts toward children that drive human parents. Every hegemony commander experiencing genuine guilt about their species' past actions. Every hegemony scientist understanding, on an emotional level, what it means to cause unnecessary suffering. The weapon couldn't be deployed from a distance. Someone would need to transport the empathy cascade directly to Hegemony Prime, the species' homeworld and the center of their military command structure. It would be a suicide mission, but its success would instantly transform the most powerful military force in the galaxy into something unrecognizable. Admiral Vasquez volunteered to lead the mission herself, but her request was denied by unanimous vote of Earth's leadership. Humanity couldn't afford to lose their most experienced military commander on what might be a doomed last stand. Instead, they chose volunteers from the crew of the Determination, the same ship that had destroyed the Kepler Station Depot where Sarah's ordeal had begun. Captain Maria Santos stood before her crew of 37 volunteers, looking at faces she had served with for years. They all understood that they were volunteering for a one-way mission. Even if the weapon worked perfectly, they would be stranded deep in enemy territory with no hope of rescue. "We're not doing this for glory," Captain Santos told them. "We're not even doing this to win a war. We're doing this because a little girl spent 17 days in hell, and we're going to make sure that never happens to any child ever again." The mission required perfect coordination with resistance movements that had been growing throughout hegemony space. Former prisoners of war like Commander Zeshai had spent months building networks of dissidents who could provide intelligence and support for Earth's final gambit. As the Determination began its journey to Hegemony Prime, similar missions were launching throughout human space. Every human colony, every research station, every merchant vessel was being prepared for the Hegemony's planned genocide. If the empathy cascade failed, humanity would make their extinction as costly as possible. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Humanity's final weapon was designed to make their enemies more human, to force them to feel the emotional connections that the hegemony considered a sign of weakness. If it worked, the galaxy's most powerful species would suddenly understand why humans had been willing to go to war over one child. But first, the Determination had to reach its target. Hegemony Prime was protected by the largest fleet ever assembled, with more firepower concentrated in one system than most species possessed in their entire military. The planet itself was surrounded by defensive platforms that could destroy a moon-sized asteroid with focused energy beams. Captain Santos had no intention of fighting her way through those defenses. Instead, she planned to use the hegemony's own predictability against them. Her ship was broadcasting standard merchant vessel identification codes and requesting permission to deliver a priority cargo shipment. According to hegemony regulations, merchant vessels carrying urgent supplies were given expedited clearance to avoid delays in the supply chain. The cargo manifest listed biological specimens for research purposes, exactly the kind of shipment that had brought Sarah Chen to hegemony attention months earlier. The officials who reviewed the request probably never noticed the grim irony of what they were approving. The Determination was escorted through the defensive perimeter by a flight of hegemony patrol ships, their crews unaware that they were guiding humanity's most dangerous weapon directly to their home world's doorstep. Captain Santos maintained perfect communications discipline, responding to all queries with standard merchant vessel protocols. As her ship approached Hegemony Prime's orbital facilities, Santos could see the massive fleet that was preparing for the final assault on human space. Thousands of ships filled the system, representing military resources that could have conquered dozens of smaller civilizations. In 3 days, that fleet would jump to hyperspace and begin the systematic extermination of every human in the galaxy. Unless Captain Santos and her crew could change the fundamental nature of the species that commanded them. The Determination docked at Processing Station Alpha 7, the same type of facility where Sarah Chen had been tortured for 17 days. The station's crew was expecting a routine biological shipment, not realizing that they were about to become ground zero for the most radical transformation in galactic history. The weapon deployment went exactly according to plan. Dr. Kowalski's nanobots spread through the station's atmosphere system within minutes, invisible and undetectable to hegemony sensors. From there, they began their work of rewriting neural pathways, installing emotional responses that the hegemony had spent millions of years evolving away from. The first signs of change appeared within hours. Hegemony personnel who had spent their careers following orders without question suddenly found themselves asking uncomfortable questions about their missions. Scientists who had treated other species as experimental subjects began experiencing overwhelming guilt about their research. Military officers who had planned the genocide of humanity started feeling protective instincts toward the very children they had been ordered to kill. Station Commander Vithrak was one of the first to experience the full effects of the empathy cascade. He had been reviewing the final preparations for the human extermination when he suddenly found himself thinking about his own offspring, whom he hadn't seen in 15 years according to standard hegemony child-rearing protocols. For the first time in his adult life, he wondered if those children missed their parents the way human children seemed to miss theirs. The emotional revelation was devastating. Commander Vithrak looked at the genocide plans spread across his desk and suddenly understood what they really meant. Millions of beings like Sarah Chen would die screaming for parents who would never be able to help them. Families would be torn apart. Children would suffer in ways that his newly empathetic mind couldn't bear to contemplate. Within 6 hours, Commander Vithrak had canceled all preparations for the human genocide and ordered his staff to begin studying human cultural practices instead. His subordinates, themselves experiencing the effects of the empathy cascade, readily agreed. Several officers were found crying at their workstations as they read reports about human families and the bonds between parents and children. But the real transformation began when the effect spread beyond Processing Station Alpha 7. The nanobots were designed to be contagious, spreading from host to host through casual contact. Within days, the entire population of Hegemony Prime was experiencing emotions they had never felt before and couldn't fully understand. The planetary government tried to declare a medical emergency, but their own officials were struggling with the same emotional revelations as everyone else. Governor Zelthos, who had personally approved the human genocide plan, spent 3 straight days reading every available document about Sarah Chen's ordeal. By the 4th day, he was broadcasting personal apologies to Earth and demanding that his species immediately cease all hostile actions against human civilians. The transformation wasn't limited to government officials. Ordinary hegemony citizens were experiencing parental love for the first time. Understanding concepts like sacrifice and compassion that had been bred out of their species for millennia. Parents who had surrendered their children to state institutions according to tradition were demanding their return. Workers who had spent their careers treating other species as inferior resources were refusing orders and demanding better treatment for non-hegemony beings. Most significantly, the hegemony military was dissolving from within. Soldiers who had been prepared to commit genocide were now experiencing the same protective instincts that drove human behavior. They couldn't understand how they had ever considered the systematic murder of children to be acceptable orders. Admiral Kessatar, Supreme Commander of the Genocide Fleet, locked himself in his quarters for 2 days after the empathy cascade reached the orbital shipyards. When he finally emerged, he issued orders that shocked his entire command structure. The fleet was to stand down immediately, all weapons were to be safed, and any officer who attempted to attack human targets would be relieved of duty. "I have read the reports about the human child," he announced to his assembled staff. I have studied the recordings of her treatment and her family's suffering. I cannot explain the feelings these materials have generated, but I know that I will not be responsible for causing such pain to other families. The genocide mission is canceled. Any officer who disagrees is welcome to request transfer to a different command. Not a single officer requested transfer. The entire command staff was experiencing the same emotional revolution that was spreading across the hegemony. They had been transformed from efficient killers into beings capable of empathy and compassion, and they couldn't imagine returning to their previous mindset. The effects of the empathy cascade weren't limited to Hegemony Prime. The nanobots had been designed to spread through hyperspace communication networks, carried by data transmissions and quantum entanglement streams. Within weeks, the transformation was affecting hegemony installations throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Council watched in amazement as reports flooded in from across hegemony space. Military bases were refusing orders to attack civilian targets. Research stations were releasing all sentient subjects and requesting permission to study ethics instead of biology. Trade officials were renegotiating contracts to ensure fair treatment for all species involved. The species that had dominated galactic civilization for 3,000 years was undergoing a fundamental psychological transformation, and it had all started with humanity's determination to protect one little girl. Ambassador Zethkar found himself isolated even among his own people. As one of the few hegemony officials who hadn't been directly exposed to the empathy cascade, he still maintained his species' traditional emotional suppression. But when he returned to Hegemony Prime to report to his government, he discovered that his superiors were no longer interested in maintaining their empire through force and intimidation. The humans were right, Governor Zelthos told him during what would be their final meeting. We have been monsters, calling our cruelty efficiency and our lack of empathy strength. I have spent the past week reading testimonies from species we have oppressed, studying the suffering we have caused, and I cannot bear the weight of what we have done. We must change everything. Ambassador Zethkar tried to argue for maintaining traditional values, for resisting the emotional contamination that was spreading through their civilization. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The transformation was too complete, too fundamental to reverse. The hegemony as they had known it was dead, replaced by something entirely new. The formal end of the war came 6 months later, but not in any way that humanity had expected. Instead of a surrender document or peace treaty, they received an invitation to attend the First Galactic Congress of Sentient Rights, hosted by the newly reformed Hegemony. The Congress was held on Hegemony Prime, in the same chambers where the genocide of humanity had been planned. But the species that greeted Earth's diplomatic delegation was unrecognizable from the one that had tortured Sarah Chen. They spoke of individual rights, the protection of children, and the fundamental value of every sentient life. Admiral Vasquez attended the Congress as Earth's military representative, accompanied by Sarah Chen herself. The 10-year-old girl who had started the war by her mere existence was now being hailed as the catalyst for the greatest transformation in galactic history. We owe you an apology that cannot be adequately expressed in any language, Governor Zelthos said to Sarah during the opening ceremony. Your suffering revealed the moral bankruptcy of our civilization and forced us to confront truths we had spent millennia avoiding. We cannot undo the harm we caused you, but we can ensure that no other child ever experiences what you endured. Sarah's response was simple and devastating. I forgive you, but promise me that you'll remember what you learned. Promise me that you'll protect other children, not just human ones, but all children. The promise became the foundation of the new galactic order. The Sentient Rights Accords established fundamental protections for all intelligent life, with special provisions for the protection of juveniles regardless of species. The document was signed by every major civilization in the galaxy, and violations would be considered acts of war against all signatory species. The hegemony voluntarily disbanded their empire, transforming their military into a peacekeeping force dedicated to protecting vulnerable populations throughout the galaxy. Their research facilities were converted to study ethics and psychology rather than weapons development. Their vast resources were redirected toward improving living conditions for species they had previously oppressed. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The hegemony's transformation had demonstrated that even the most entrenched civilizations could be reformed when they truly understood the consequences of their actions. Other species began examining their own practices, questioning traditions that might cause unnecessary suffering. The Crystalline Confederation established new protocols for protecting emotional species from psychological harm. The Gas Giant Collective began programs to support vulnerable individuals within their hive mind structure. Even species that had previously shown little interest in individual rights began developing legal frameworks to protect their weakest members. Dr. Elena Kowalski received the galaxy's first Nobel Prize for Interspecies Ethics, recognizing her development of the empathy cascade as the most significant contribution to galactic civilization in recorded history. But she accepted the award in Sarah Chen's name, crediting a 10-year-old girl with having the wisdom to understand that their enemy's greatest weakness was their inability to feel compassion. The weapon itself was never used again. The technology was sealed away by mutual agreement of all galactic species, too dangerous to deploy, but too important to forget. The threat of forcing empathy on aggressors became a deterrent more powerful than any military fleet. Earth's position in the galactic community was transformed overnight. The species that had been dismissed as primitive emotional mammals was now recognized as the moral center of galactic civilization. Human concepts of individual rights, parental love, and protective instincts became the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to be truly civilized. Sarah Chen grew up to become humanity's first ambassador to the reformed hegemony, working alongside former enemies to establish educational programs that would prevent future generations from repeating their ancestors' mistakes. She never forgot her 17 days in captivity, but she chose to use that experience as a foundation for building something better. On her 18th birthday, Sarah received a communication from every hegemony world in the galaxy. Millions of former soldiers, scientists, and officials who had been transformed by the empathy cascade sent personal messages of gratitude to the child whose suffering had opened their eyes to the value of compassion. "You taught us what it means to care about others," one message read. "You showed us that protecting children isn't a sign of weakness, but the truest measure of a civilization's worth. Because of you, our children will grow up in a galaxy where every life matters." The war that began with one child's ordeal had ended with the transformation of galactic civilization itself. Humanity had proven that when you threaten their young, they will move heaven and earth to protect them. But more than that, they had shown the galaxy that the qualities other species considered weaknesses, emotion, empathy, the fierce love of parents for their children, were actually the strongest forces in the universe. Years later, when historians studied the conflict that reshaped galactic civilization, they would struggle to understand how such massive changes could have stemmed from such a small incident. A minor shipping dispute, a single detained child, a species that refused to accept that any life was disposable. But those who had lived through the transformation understood the truth. It was never about military strategy or political maneuvering. It was about the fundamental question of what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in. A galaxy where children could be tortured with bureaucratic indifference, or a galaxy where every young life was protected by all the forces of civilization. Humanity had answered that question definitively. They thought one child didn't matter, so Earth declared all-out war to prove them wrong. And in the end, They had proven that a single child's suffering could indeed change the fate of trillions of beings across the stars. The galaxy learned to never again underestimate the species that would risk everything to protect their young. Because when humans say that every life matters, they mean it with a ferocity that can reshape the cosmos itself. Sarah Chen's 17 days in captivity had become the foundation for 17,000 years of peace, built on the simple understanding that protecting children isn't weakness. It's the highest expression of what it means to be truly alive.